My name is David. I'm 41 years old now, but this happened a little over 5 years ago. My background is in the Army. I spent 8 years as a scout, mostly reconnaissance and long-range surveillance. When I got out, I put my skills to use in a quieter profession, land surveying. It kept me outdoors, which I've always loved, and it paid the bills. I'm telling you this not to brag, but to establish that I am not a person prone to fantasy. I am trained to observe, to document, and to report facts. What I saw in the Zaleski State Forest in southeastern Ohio was not a bear. It was not a man in a suit, and it was not a hallucination brought on by stress. It was real, and it killed 2 of my friends. Every autumn, my brother Jake, a couple of friends, and I would rent the same remote cabin for a week-long hunting trip. It was our tradition. The cabin was old, built from thick, dark logs, and sat at the end of a long gravel road that was barely more than a path cut through the dense woods. There was no cell service, no internet, and the nearest town was a 40-minute drive away. It was perfect. Isolation was the entire point. That year, it was me, Jake, and 2 other guys we'd known since high school, Brian and Corey. Jake was like me, steady and capable in the woods. Corey had been a Marine, 4 years in Force Recon, so he was even more squared away than I was. Brian was the comic relief. He worked in sales, loved the idea of the trip more than the reality of it, and treated the whole thing as an excuse to drink beer and tell bad jokes. He was a city guy through and through. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in late October. The air was crisp, and the trees were a riot of orange and red. The woods felt alive, vibrant. We unpacked the truck, hauling coolers, duffel bags, and rifle cases into the cabin. The place smelled of pine cleaner and wood smoke. We went through our usual routine. I checked the cabin's perimeter, making sure no windows were broken and the shutters were functional. Corey, ever the Marine, did a quick inventory of our supplies: food, water, first aid, ammunition. Jake got the generator running and filled the lamps with oil. Brian's job was to get the fire going in the stone fireplace, a task he managed with his usual theatrical complaining. It felt normal. It felt safe. That first evening was completely ordinary. We sat by the fire, eating chili Jake had made, listening to the crackle of the logs. Brian was telling some ridiculous story about a client, and Corey was methodically cleaning his rifle, a habit he never broke. I remember looking out the big picture window into the encroaching darkness. The woods at night have a presence, a weight to them. You can feel the sheer scale of the life and death happening just beyond the thin pane of glass. But that night it felt peaceful. We were 4 friends in a fortress of warmth and light, insulated from the world. We talked about our plans for the morning hunt, where we'd set up our stands. We turned in around 11, feeling good. The generator hummed its low, steady rhythm outside, a comforting sound in the deep quiet. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. I was always the first one up. I killed the generator to save fuel and stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee. The pre-dawn air was cold and sharp, and it was silent. Utterly, unnaturally silent. Normally, that time of day is a chorus of birds waking up, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small things in the underbrush. There was nothing. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, listening quiet. The kind of silence that means a predator is nearby, and everything else has gone still in its presence. I felt it before in Afghanistan, right before an ambush. It's a primal warning that prickles the skin on your arms. I stood there for a long time, scanning the tree line, my coffee forgotten in my hand. The woods just watched back. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the feeling persisted. It was a deep, gut-level wrongness. When Jake came out a few minutes later, he felt it too. I didn't even have to say anything. He just stood next to me, looking out at the same silent woods. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice low. "Bobcat? Maybe a bear wandered through?" I shrugged. Could be. Never heard it this quiet before, though. We decided to stick to our plan, but to be more cautious. Corey and Brian emerged, Brian still groggy and complaining about the cold. He didn't notice the silence, of course. For him, the woods were just a green wall. Corey noticed. He just gave me and Jake a questioning look, and we both gave a slight nod. The message was understood. We split into two pairs, as usual. Me with Brian, Jake with Corey. We agreed to stay in radio contact, checking in every hour. Brian and I headed east, toward a ridge where we'd seen deer sign in previous years. He was chattering away, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the dead air. I had to tell him to keep it down, which only made him grumble. After about a mile, we found it. It was a doe, or what was left of one. It was lying in a small clearing, and the scene was one of absolute carnage. It hadn't been killed and eaten by a predator. It had been torn apart. One of its back legs was ripped clean from the hip socket, lying a good 10 feet away. Its torso was twisted at an impossible angle, the spine clearly snapped. The rib cage was splayed open, but the organs weren't neatly consumed. They were just scattered. It was an act of extreme, explosive violence, not hunger. I've seen animal kills my whole life. I've seen what bears do, what coyotes and cougars do. They are efficient. They kill, they eat, they leave. This was different. This was rage. The sheer strength required to tear a full-grown deer apart like that was immense, far beyond that of a black bear. "Holy hell," Brian whispered, his jokey demeanor gone. "What did this?" I knelt, examining the ground. The leaf litter was too thick and disturbed for clear prints, but I could see deep gouges in the earth, as if something had braced itself while pulling the animal apart. "I don't know," I said, and it was the honest truth. "But we're going back." Brian didn't argue. The sight had shaken him badly. We turned around and walked back to the cabin, my hand resting on the pistol on my hip. I radioed Jake and told him what we found. I described the scene in flat, factual terms. There was a pause on the other end, then Corey's voice came through. "Copy that, David. We're heading back too. We found something on our end." When they got back to the cabin an hour later, their faces were grim. "Tracks," Jake said, pulling out his phone to show me a picture. "Down by the creek bed. Too big for a bear and the wrong shape." I looked at the photo. The print was pressed deep into the mud. It was huge, elongated, with 5 distinct toes ending in what looked like claw marks. But the overall shape was disturbingly like a massive human foot, only narrower at the heel and wider at the toes. It wasn't a bear track. It wasn't a hoax made with some novelty Bigfoot stompers either. The weight distribution was obvious in how the mud had been displaced. It was the track of a living, heavy creature. "Whatever made this," Corey said, his voice flat, "is bipedal, and it weighs a hell of a lot." Brian was starting to look pale. "Bipedal? What, like Bigfoot? You guys are serious?" He tried to laugh, but it came out as a nervous cough. "It's probably just some weird bear print." "Bears don't walk on 2 legs for miles, Brian," Corey countered, his patience thin. "And they don't leave prints like this. Their hind foot is shaped differently." We spent the rest of the day inside the cabin. The hunting trip was over before it began. The mood had shifted from excitement to a low-grade simmering dread. We locked the doors and shuttered all the windows except the large one in the living room. We kept our rifles close. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a known animal with a deformity. Maybe it was a prank, though the sheer violence of the deer kill made that seem unlikely. No one could come up with a good explanation. As dusk fell, The forest outside remained silent. The birds never came back. We turned on the generator early, the noise a welcome intrusion, a shield against the oppressive quiet. We sat around the fire, but no one was talking much. Every small sound from outside, a branch falling, the wind in the eaves, made us jump. The first direct interaction happened around midnight. We were all trying to get some sleep. I was on the couch, a shotgun loaded with buckshot next to me. Corey was in an armchair near the door, his rifle across his lap. Jake and Brian were in the back bedroom. I was drifting in and out of a light, uneasy sleep when I heard it. Thump. A pause. Thump. It was the sound of heavy footfalls on the soft earth outside. Slow, deliberate. They were too heavy for a person, and the cadence was wrong for a four-legged animal. It was the stride of something massive on two legs. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked over at Corey. His eyes were wide in the firelight, and he slowly, silently, raised a single finger to his lips. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin. Thump, thump, thump. Then they stopped, right outside the main wall. We heard a low, sniffing sound, wet and guttural, coming from just outside the window. It was so close. The sheer proximity of it, the sound of this unknown thing's breath, was terrifying. My training kicked in. Threat assessment. The walls were thick logs. The door was solid oak. The windows were shuttered. We were secure, for now. Then came a sound that chilled me to the bone. A faint scratching against the wall. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It moved along the logs like something was testing the surface, feeling for a weak point. The sound moved to the front door. We heard the old brass doorknob rattle softly. Then it turned. Click. The deadbolt held. The knob was released. It was testing the locks. This wasn't a dumb animal. This was intelligent. It was problem-solving. Corey and I exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated fear. A bear doesn't turn a doorknob. The thing outside let out a low, frustrated huff, a sound that was half growl, half sigh. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the door and toward the back of the cabin. A moment later, Jake and Brian burst out of the bedroom. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered, his face ashen. Brian looked like he was about to be sick. "It was right outside our window," he stammered. "I heard it breathing." The sounds eventually faded as the creature moved off into the woods. None of us slept for the rest of the night. We just sat there in the dim light, armed and waiting, listening to the silence that had returned. By morning, we had a plan. We were leaving. There was no discussion, no debate. We would wait for full daylight, pack only the essentials into the truck, and get the hell out of there. The feeling of being watched was constant, a physical pressure on the back of my neck. Around 7 in the morning, with the sun fully up, we started to move. Corey and I stood guard on the porch, rifles ready, while Jake and Brian quickly loaded gear into the truck. The air was still cold, and our breath plumed in front of us. The woods were as quiet as they had been the day before. I was scanning the tree line, my eyes tracing every shadow, every dark space between the trunks. And then I saw it. It was for less than a second, a flicker of movement about 100 yards out. It was a shape, tall and broad, stepping from behind one thick oak to another. It was dark, almost black, and it moved with a fluid speed that was unnerving for its size. My first thought was a man in a ghillie suit, but it was too big. The shoulders were too wide, the proportions wrong. The arms seemed long, hanging low. It was just a glimpse,
a silhouette against the slightly brighter background of the deeper woods. But it was enough. It was real, and it was watching us.
"Contact," I said, my voice tight. 100 yards, east. Corey swung his rifle in that direction, peering through his scope. "I don't see it," he said after a moment. "It's gone." "It was there," I insisted. "Big, moving fast." The confirmation, however fleeting, solidified our fear into something cold and hard. We were being stalked by something large, intelligent, and patient. We sped up the packing, practically throwing the last of the bags into the truck bed. We were all in agreement. Leave the rest. The coolers, the extra food, none of it mattered. We were just about to get in the truck. I was doing a final sweep of the area, my rifle up. Jake was in the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. Corey was covering the rear. Brian, his nerve completely shot, stood by the passenger door, wringing his hands. I have to go," he said, his voice shaky. "Real quick." Before any of us could stop him, he stepped away from the truck, toward the edge of the small clearing, to relieve himself behind a bush. "Brian, get back here," I hissed. "Now!" He waved a dismissive hand, his back to us. "It'll take 2 seconds." It was a fatal mistake. It was the single moment of carelessness that the creature had been waiting for. From the dense woods just beyond the bush, there was an explosion of movement. It wasn't a charge. It was an instantaneous, silent arrival. One moment, there was just the woods. The next, this thing was there. A scream was ripped from Brian's throat, a choked, gargling sound that was cut off almost immediately. That was the first time I saw it clearly. It stood to its full height over Brian's fallen form, and my mind simply refused to process it for a second. It was impossible. It stood on 2 legs that were bent backward like a dog's, but it was easily 8 feet tall. Its body was a grotesque fusion of man and beast, covered in coarse, dark fur. The shoulders were immense, a solid block of muscle, tapering down to a narrow waist. The arms were what terrified me the most. They were too long for its body, hanging down almost to its knees, and at the end of them were not paws but 5-fingered hands, black and leathery, tipped with thick, yellowed claws. But the head, my God, the head. It was the head of a monstrous canine, like a wolf or a mastiff, but scaled up to nightmarish proportions. It had a long snout filled with jagged teeth, the lips pulled back in a permanent snarl. And the eyes glowed. It wasn't a reflection, like a cat's eye in the dark. It was a faint internal luminescence, a sickly yellow-orange light that seemed to burn with malevolent intelligence. It held Brian's body pinned to the ground with one of its clawed hands, its head bent down. There was a wet, tearing sound. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Corey was the first to react. He brought his rifle up and fired, a 3-round burst. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence. All 3 rounds hit the creature in its massive upper torso. It recoiled, not like an animal that was fatally wounded, but like a man who'd been punched hard. It let out a deafening roar, a sound that was a mix of a dog's bark and a lion's roar, but deeper, more guttural, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. It dropped Brian's body and turned its glowing eyes on us. The intelligence in that gaze was the most horrifying part. It wasn't the dumb rage of a beast. It was calculating. It was hate. "Get in the cabin!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Go! Now!" Jake was already scrambling out of the truck. We abandoned the vehicle and ran for the cabin, the only defensible position we had. The creature took a step toward us, its strange, backward-jointed legs moving with an unnatural gait. It was fast. We slammed the heavy oak door shut just as its weight hit the other side with a thunderous boom that shook the entire frame. I threw the deadbolt and slid a heavy iron bar into place, a feature of the old cabin I'd never been more thankful for. The siege began. The creature outside let out another of those ground-shaking roars, a sound of pure fury. Then it started beating on the door, a rhythmic, powerful pounding that made the wood groan. Boom, boom, boom. Corey was at one of the shuttered windows, peering through a small crack. "There's two of them," he said, his voice grim. "Another one just came out of the woods, a little smaller." My blood ran cold. We weren't dealing with one monster. We were dealing with a pair, or a pack. The pounding on the door stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a massive impact struck the side of the cabin. A log, thrown with incredible force, had hit the wall right next to a window. Another crash followed as a rock the size of a microwave shattered one of the upper-story windows we hadn't been able to shutter. Glass rained down on the floor upstairs. They were using tools. They were trying to break us down. "David, the back!" Jake yelled. I ran to the rear of the cabin. Through a slit in the kitchen shutters, I could see the second, slightly smaller creature. It was systematically tearing the wooden porch apart, ripping thick planks away from the frame with its bare hands. It was trying to weaken the structure, or maybe get access to the foundation. This was coordinated. It was tactical. One was trying to breach the front, the other was working on the back. Corey took charge. "Jake, stay here, cover the back. David, with me. We need to create a crossfire if they get in." He was all marine now, his fear channeled into focused action. He directed me to a window on the opposite side of the living room from him. "We fire on anything that isn't human. Aim for the head or center mass. Conserve your ammo." It was a good plan, but it felt futile against the sheer power we were facing. A new sound started, a deep, grinding, splintering noise from the front. The larger creature was tearing at the doorframe with its claws. I could see the wood splintering inward around the edges of the door. It wasn't just hitting it anymore. It was trying to rip it out of the wall. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The hum of the generator cut out. Outside, there was a sharp, metallic tearing sound, followed by the triumphant roar of the creature. It had found and ripped the power line from the cabin wall. We were plunged into the dim, gray light filtering through the cracks in the shutters. Panic started to set in for Jake. "They cut the power. Oh God, they cut the power." "Stay focused," Corey barked, not taking his eyes off his window slit. "Use your ears. They're loud." He was right. We could hear them moving, their heavy bodies crashing through the underbrush, their low growls a constant, menacing presence. For the next hour, it was a terrifying waiting game, punctuated by violence. They would go silent for long stretches, lulling us into a state of heightened anxiety, then suddenly attack from a new direction. A heavy log would slam into the roof. Claws would scrape against a shuttered window. At one point, the larger one came back to the front door. It didn't pound this time. It just stood there. We could hear its breathing, a low, wet rasp. Then a voice spoke, or rather a sound that was a twisted mockery of a voice. It was a low, gurgling sound that formed a single word. "Come out." It was Brian's voice. It was a perfect, horrifying mimicry of his voice, laced with a wet, guttural undertone. Jake let out a choked sob. "They're trying to trick us," Corey said, his own voice strained. "Don't listen." The psychological aspect was almost worse than the physical assault. They were intelligent enough to know that using our dead friend's voice would terrorize us. They weren't just trying to kill us. They were enjoying it. The smaller one started climbing. We heard its claws scraping against the logs of the outer wall, finding purchase, moving upward. It was going for the roof. Corey and I looked at each other. The roof was the cabin's weakest point. "It's trying to get to the chimney," he whispered. The fireplace. The one big hole leading directly into our fortress. I ran to the fireplace, my heart in my throat. The fire had died down to glowing embers. I looked up the flue. It was dark, but I could hear it. A scratching, scrabbling sound from above. It was on the roof, right over the chimney. I grabbed the poker and frantically stoked the embers, throwing on fresh logs, desperate to get a roaring fire going again. If it came down that chimney, I wanted it to come down into an inferno. Smoke started to fill the room as the fire caught. Suddenly, a tremendous crash came from the front of the cabin. I spun around. The main picture window, the one we hadn't been able to shutter completely, had been breached. The larger creature had hurled its own body against it. The thick safety glass had spiderwebbed and bowed inward, but it had held. The creature roared in frustration and hit it again. This time the frame splintered, and the entire window assembly buckled, hanging precariously. A massive, clawed hand reached through a crack, fumbling for a purchase. Corey didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired 2 shots. The hand, as big as a dinner plate, flinched and pulled back. A deep, pained howl echoed from outside. "I hit it," Corey yelled. "I think I hit it good." But his triumph was short-lived. The creature on the roof, perhaps spurred on by the other's pain, redoubled its efforts. A shower of soot and mortar dust fell down the chimney. It was trying to break the stone cap. We were trapped. One was about to break through the front window. The other was about to come down the chimney. We were out of options. Jake was frozen in the back, just staring at the kitchen door, muttering to himself. It was Corey who made the decision. He looked at me, his face set and grim. There was a strange calmness in his eyes. "David," he said, his voice steady. "The truck keys, are they still in the ignition?" I remembered Jake fumbling with them. "Yeah, I think so." "Okay," Corey said, taking a deep breath. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to draw their attention, both of them. When I open that door, you and Jake run for the truck. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just go. You understand?" "Corey, no," I said, my voice shaking. "We're not leaving you." "There is no we," he said, his voice hard as iron. "This is the only play we have left. 2 of us might make it. None of us will if we stay here. That's an order." He wasn't my commanding officer, but in that moment, he was. He was the Marine, making the tactical sacrifice. He didn't give me time to argue. He moved to the front door, his rifle held at the ready. "Get Jake," he commanded. I ran to my brother and grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. He was like a sleepwalker, his eyes wide and vacant. "Corey, what are you doing?" he mumbled. "Saving us," Corey said, his back to us. He took one last look around the ruined cabin. "Tell my wife. Tell her I love her." Then he took a deep breath, unbarred the door, and kicked it open. He stepped out onto the porch, into the gray morning light, and let out a defiant yell. "Hey, you ugly sons of bitches, come and get me." He opened fire, his rifle barking in the enclosed space of the porch. The large creature, which had been about to smash through the window again, turned its attention to him. It roared and charged. From the roof, we heard a heavy thump as the second creature dropped down to join the fight. "Go!" Corey screamed over the sound of gunfire and monstrous roars. "Go now!" I dragged Jake through the open door and off the side of the porch, away from the fight. We hit the ground and scrambled to our feet. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I heard Corey's rifle fire a few more times, then a sickening, wet crunch, and a human scream that was cut short. Then there was only the sound of the creatures, snarling and tearing. We ran. We ran harder than I have ever run in my life. Adrenaline and pure terror propelled us across the clearing toward the truck. My lungs burned. Branches whipped at my face. We reached the truck, and I threw Jake into the passenger seat and jumped behind the wheel. The keys were there. I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life. For a single, beautiful second, I thought we had made it. Then I put the truck in reverse and hit the gas. The engine whined, but the truck barely moved. I heard a flapping sound. Flap, flap, flap. I looked in the rearview mirror. Both rear tires were flat, slashed to ribbons. Long, deep gouges ran through the rubber. They had disabled our escape route before the attack even began.
The intelligence, the foresight of it was staggering. "They cut the tires," I yelled at Jake, a wave of despair washing over me. "We have to run for it." Behind us, the sounds from the cabin had stopped. A new sound began, the heavy, rhythmic thump, thump of something large coming our way. We bailed out of the truck and ran into the woods, heading for the gravel road. We just picked a direction and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, tripping over roots, our only thought to put distance between us and them. We could hear them behind us. Not a full-out pursuit, but a steady, relentless following. A branch would snap to our left. A low growl would rumble from our right. They were herding us. They were playing with us. We ran for what felt like hours. My legs were lead, my throat raw. Jake was stumbling, falling, and I had to keep pulling him up, screaming at him to keep moving. We lost the road. We were just lost in an endless sea of silent, watching trees.
I was sure we were going to die out there. I was starting to slow down, my body giving out. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and I saw it, about 50 yards back, pacing us, the larger one. It was just loping along, its long arms swinging, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on us. It wasn't even breathing hard. Then, a change. The sun, which had been hidden behind a thick cloud cover, broke through. A shaft of bright, direct sunlight hit the creature. It flinched back, raising a clawed hand to shield its eyes, and let out an angry, hissing growl. It stopped its pursuit, retreating into the deeper shadows of the forest. It didn't like the light. That was our chance. The sun was our shield. I grabbed Jake and we pushed on, trying to stay in the sunlit patches as much as possible. We didn't hear them anymore. They had retreated, waiting for dusk. We stumbled on for another hour, maybe more. My sense of time was gone. Finally, through the trees, I saw the glint of asphalt. A road. A real, paved road. We broke out of the tree line and collapsed onto the shoulder of a 2-lane county highway. We were covered in scratches, mud, and blood. We must have looked like madmen. A few cars sped past, their drivers staring. Finally, a beat-up old pickup truck slowed and pulled over. An old farmer with a weathered face looked down at us. "You boys need some help?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I just nodded, unable to speak. I don't remember the ride into town. I think I passed out. I woke up in a hospital. A sheriff's deputy was sitting in a chair by my bed. Jake was in the next room, sedated. I told the deputy everything. I started from the silent woods and the mutilated deer, and ended with Corey's sacrifice and our desperate flight. I told it calmly and factually, just like a report. I could see the disbelief in his eyes, masked by professional politeness. He took my statement, nodding and writing in his little notebook. "So, a large animal," he said, summarizing, "like a bear." "No," I said firmly, "not a bear. I know what a bear looks like. This was not a bear." They sent a team of deputies out to the cabin later that day. The official story came back a few days later. A tragic freak bear attack. They said they found large, indeterminate tracks and signs of a struggle consistent with a particularly aggressive black bear. The damage to the cabin was attributed to the animal's frantic attempts to get at the food inside. Brian and Corey's remains. They were found. The official cause of death for both was listed as animal predation. The slashed tires on my truck were noted as likely damaged on the rough terrain of the access road. Case closed. It was a cover-up. Not a grand conspiracy, but the simple, bureaucratic kind.
The kind where a story is too wild, too unbelievable, and would cause a panic, so it gets smoothed over and filed away under a more palatable explanation. No one wanted to believe in monsters. It was easier to believe in a 1 in a million rabid bear. My testimony was dismissed as the ramblings of a man suffering from shock and trauma. They suggested I seek counseling. Only one person seemed to believe me. An older deputy, a man near retirement. He came to see me just before I was discharged from the hospital. He closed the door to my room and spoke in a low voice. "I read your full statement," he said, not looking at me, but at the wall. "The unedited one." He paused. "You're not the first person to come out of those woods with a story like that. Happens every 10, 15 years. Someone goes missing or a hunter is found in pieces. We always call it a bear." He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a tired resignation. "My advice to you? Move on. Forget what you saw, and never, ever go back into that forest. Some things are better left alone." He left without another word. It was a cold comfort. I wasn't crazy, but I was alone with the truth. It's been 5 years. I live in the city now. I sold my rifles. I quit my job. I can't be in the woods anymore. The silence of the trees isn't peaceful to me now. It's menacing. Every shadow seems to hold a tall, broad-shouldered shape. Every snap of a twig sends my heart into overdrive. Jake and I, we don't talk much anymore.
The thing we shared is too heavy. It broke something between us. We both survived, but I think a part of us died in that cabin with Corey and Brian. I carry the guilt of their deaths every single day. I see Corey's face, calm and resolved as he prepared to sacrifice himself. I hear Brian's last choked scream. I have nightmares. I see glowing yellow eyes in the dark. I hear the sound of claws on wood. Sometimes, late at night, I go online. I search obscure forums and websites reading stories from others. Stories of tall, canine-headed creatures that walk on 2 legs. Stories of impossible speed and strength, of terrifying intelligence. There are more of them than you would think. Hundreds of them. All dismissed. All explained away. We are a quiet community of survivors, bound by a trauma no one else will acknowledge. I am telling you this because the deputy was wrong. Some things can't be left alone. They need to be known. People need to be warned. There are things in the deep, dark places of the world that are not in any science book. They are ancient, they are intelligent, and they are hostile. If you are ever in the woods and the birds go silent, leave. If you find tracks you can't identify, leave. If your gut tells you something is wrong, trust that instinct. It's a survival mechanism we've forgotten how to use. Don't make the same mistakes we did. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't hesitate. Just get out. Because they are out there, and they are watching, and they are waiting.